26 too, at least formally. So we have two really big issues that affect everyone in the world, particularly citizens, normal people. So the first thing I'm going to do is just ask Mark, what is civic space? I mean, what is this phrase? What does it mean? Is it the agora? Is it democracy? Is it something else? What is it?
Steve, thanks. And I think we have a moderator who imagined that civic space was something like the public parks.
Use your microphone, sorry.
Thank you, Steve. I was saying I think we may have a moderator who thinks that civic space should mean public parks and other municipal facilities.
Ferris wheels, yeah.
Yeah, but indeed, and maybe there was a happy time when that's indeed what it was. But, you know, in a world where we're seeing government just close the space for protest, for free speech, for organizing, you know, that's harder and harder. So, I mean, just to take a very contemporary example, you mentioned Glasgow. Well, last weekend, a very large group of young people led by Greta Thunberg demonstrated peacefully in Glasgow and already condemned the outcome of COP as government blah blah and not achieving real results. Well, in a very large number of countries in the world, that demonstration would have been banned or broken up by the police, or the press would have been prevented from covering it. And indeed, you know, even during COVID, 100 countries, often for perfectly reasonable public health reasons, but often not, have in different ways limited freedom of assembly. And so, you know, just over the last year, a clock has been turned the wrong way and needs to be turned back.
Right. Myo Min, Myanmar is a very good example of a place where civic space has not just been closed down, but shut down. It's been repressed. So two questions come up. Obviously, one is, how did that affect the course of the COVID pandemic? And two, which is harder, maybe we could get into it a bit later, what would you like the world to do about it other than wring its hands?
Thank you. My name is Aung Myo Min. I'm from Myanmar. So your question is rightly posed for the situation right now in Myanmar. And then about the civil space in the country. Mm-hmm. So now I'm the long-time human rights activist. I've been fighting for the fundamental rights and strengthening the civil society and creating the civil space where fundamental rights of everyone is granted. And the civil society have a freedom to speak, to assembly, and then to raise the issue that related to Myanmar, to related to the country. But, you know, country like Myanmar has so long history of oppression, repression on the civil society and civil space. You can see that, you know, we have country is all everywhere at the human rights radar of violations. But COVID situation make a big impact for the civil society. One is good, positive way. Mm-hmm. Civil society in the country, you know, stand up together, work together with the health sectors, and fight against the COVID corona in the first COVID wave. It is really great engagement with the civil society and building civil space, countering COVID together. This is a pandemic issue. Mm-hmm. But on the negative side, mm-hmm. the Myanmar right now, military is weaponizing COVID to suppress the civil society and civil space.
How is it doing that?
Well, you know, first thing, you know, they attack on the health workers who are providing health assistance and countering COVID. Myanmar is a country right now where medics or medical health workers are arrested for giving health education. Mm-hmm. Myanmar is a country where nurses are arrested because they are nursing to the ailing people. Mm-hmm. So providing COVID is a crime right now. Many of the medics and health workers are arrested, detained. And many, you know, workers, denied to return back to the government service because they are launching civil disobedient movement, showing defiance against the military.
Right.
But they are always warranted. So this is how the military right now are, making the great impact and threat to the civil society and movement of civic the space in the country.
Thank you. Maina, you're with Human Rights Watch from Kenya. Is it possible to build back better, this terrible phrase? I mean, first you have to build back, right? If governments continue to restrict the civic space, I mean, obviously COVID has been a great excuse for some governments in the name of collective health to restrict individual freedoms. Do you think that may continue?
Well, I think, let me say first of all, thank you for this. I'm glad to be here, and it's interesting to be part of this conversation. We need to, first of all, we need to build back. And one of the things that we have seen across the world at a global level is the fact that if you don't have strong civil society, you really do not have much of a country that's outside the state or fundamentalism. So civil society that's active, that's busy, that's not under the control of the state is an integral part of nationhood in a way that is sustainable going ahead. So that's got to be there. And you need, and I think we look at the recent withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, the fact that $2 trillion was used without building a civil society means that it was relatively easy to be able to, for the Taliban to walk in and do what they did. So civil society is a bulwark for the foundational values of any state, democratic state especially, and also for even the economic and social levels of any country. So they provide services sometimes, but they also provide accountability mechanisms. And those are vital to building a nation going forward. So Africa went through, during the COVID, the hard part of it, many countries in Africa had a securitized model in dealing with it. So if you don't wear a mask, the police will arrest you. And then they put you in a prison cell with about 400 people without, as though that's going to be helpful. So the securitization of these things did not help.
Right.
And so there's got to be some place where states do not use the police and policing as the only weapon when they're dealing with a crisis like this. Because it is a global crisis, but there are many ways in which you can deal with it, even if people aren't wearing a mask or they're outside the curfew times or they're going somewhere they're not supposed to be. You don't have to arrest them and then put them in a van and do all that stuff. So there are things that need to be worked on. But I think I'm kind of hopeful because wherever we go, wherever you see anything, it is social movements and people with civil society that are leading the charge to go forward. And without that, you really can't have real change.
Yeah. No, thank you. And then, of course, there's the Macron model, which is to tell the French if they want to go into a restaurant or a museum, they're going to have to be vaccinated. I don't know if that works everywhere, but it certainly works here. Yeah, go ahead.
It's one of those things where you hear people saying that that these are restrictions against individual liberties, but across the world now, everybody uses a safety belt in the car. Nobody, you should
Not
have a right.
everybody.
Well, most people are.
I've lived in Russia. They don't use them there.
Bar Russia. So bar Russia, everybody has a safety belt wherever they go. And it's something that's come through education, but also the state saying you're breaking the law. You've got to wear a seat belt. And I think that my sense of this thing about the vaccine is to say to people, fine, if you don't have the vaccine, don't. But then you must pay for a test every 3 days.
Right.
So you have a choice.
Right.
Either you pay for a test or you take the vaccine.
Right.
And you pay for the test. So you make it economically difficult for people to say, because the vaccine is helping. There's no doubt the science is quite clear.
This is nudge.
And it's not just about you, it's about everybody else around you.
That's right. Lisa, I'm sorry not to have you here, but we can see you. And in a similar way, I mean, governments have obviously taken all kinds of emergency powers, sometimes restricting free expression, restricting assembly. Given the nature of the virus, perhaps some of that makes sense, frankly. But does it make recovery harder, do you think? Is there a real risk of losing democratic consent and accountability?
Thank you, Stephen. I'd say absolutely so. And I'm just going to throw one piece of evidence at you from the work we do on monitoring civic space across the world. Since the start of the pandemic, over 100 countries have introduced changes in people's ability to organize, particularly in terms of their ability to express their right to peaceful assembly, so their right to protest and to take collective action on issues that matter to them. And many of these restrictions don't have sunset clauses. So basically, they've been put in as part of an ongoing journey of dismantling democratic processes and institutions. And we're not just talking about countries which have a history of closed civic space. At this point in time, the United Kingdom is on the Civicus Monitor watch list for several pieces of legislation that are being debated in Parliament right now, including the Policing Act, aimed at curbing the right to peaceful assembly. So as if it's not bad enough to have more than half the member states of the UN bringing in these kind of changes which directly affect the ability of people to exercise their civic freedoms. There are nearly 80 countries where explicit examples of excessive force have been used against peaceful protesters, and nearly 30 countries where lethal force, which has actually resulted in the death of protesters, has been used. I think so. The trend really shows that there has been a misuse of the pandemic really to put in place measures, to put in place restrictions which are in no way justified by the health or the public health concerns that should have been exercised as a result of the pandemic. And I totally support what Mainakia has said in terms of, just a culture of undermining rights, of undermining the ability of people to even express dissent or to debate some of the measures that governments have been using has really been reinforced in this period.
Mm-hmm. Though you could argue, at least some people argue, that a lot of civil space has been given over to crazy theories, to anti-vaxxers, to populists. That's, I guess, comes with the democratic territory, right? Or is this possibly a problem when you're dealing with a pandemic?
So this year we brought out a report, which is a review of 10 years of trends in civic space and civil society. And the craziest theory I want to add to everything you've said is the fact that there is an extremely visible nexus, not just between politicians and people who have an interest in promoting right-wing populism and narrow nationalism, but actually in the agencies that are in support of ultra-capitalism. So the link between the political elite and the economic elite has been more apparent during the period of the pandemic than ever before. And I think this comes through in terms of, the increased but also invisible role of the private sector really in not just promoting, but also implementing civic space restrictions. And the domain where this is very, very clearly seen is really the domain of technology. So censorship, surveillance, disinformation against civil society, and targeted propaganda against human rights defenders, leading to acts of violence and harassment in real life, have been rampant across regions and countries, and it is really pointing towards something that the climate movement has really exposed for us, which is with the nexus between, again, the economic elite and the political elite. And I think there's a real call to do two things. One, that the right to protest, the right to dissent is the only tool that people have, especially young people have in the younger generation, that it doesn't even have the right to vote. Their ability to hold governments and businesses accountable depends on that, and we need to be doing much more to defend that. And the second is really a rethinking of mechanisms for participation in local and international institutions. So the UN celebrated 75 years last year, and there have been some very concrete proposals about ensuring direct citizen participation in all spaces of the UN. And I think that's something we can really take forward, particularly with 75 years of the UN Declaration of Human Rights coming up in 2023
Great.
as well.
Thank you. Ambassador Ray, thank you for joining us, even virtually. You come from a country that seems to do lots of things right. I sometimes tease your fellow countrymen and say you're decaffeinated America. But you have less of the passion, it seems, and less of the problems. But at the same time, as I remember, Canada put in very strict restrictions on travel even within Canada, right? So, I mean, could you talk a bit about, a country that is really a model of democracy, and how it worked in terms of restricting people's freedoms, not necessarily their freedom to vote or speak, but certainly their freedom to travel.
Well, I think you have to distinguish between measures that are can be seen to be justifiable because of public health, and measures that go well beyond that. And I think that's what a number of your guests have been referring to. I mean, I'm somewhat embarrassed by what you say about Canada, and also I don't particularly like being described as someone without passion. I don't feel that way at all. But I feel quite passionate about the issues that are being discussed today, particularly about the importance of our recognizing that without dissent, we don't have democracy.
Yes.
And I think we really have to understand that there are differing and competing definitions and ideas of democracy that have been floating around for a long time. But one of the things that we have to be very clear, and as the representative of a government, I say this quite proudly, there is no democracy without dissent. And in that dissent, there will always be views that I disagree with. I mean, there's a lot of anti-vax nonsense that goes around that is captured social media, and we see it on television and elsewhere. It's in some cases, I think it's very dangerous. I think the way it's caught hold in a number of countries is making it very difficult for us to get to a better health outcome. But I would never suggest that we limit the ability of people to talk and to express their views and to have those views challenged in the public marketplace, which is what we have to do in the public space. And I think I told you, Stephen, in my email to you that I would be basing my remarks on a famous poem and song by Leonard Cohen, where he talks about, there are no perfect offerings, and we have to recognize that we're not looking for perfection. But we also have to recognize that there's a crack in everything. And that's where the light gets in. And I think the civic space is where the light gets in. And that's why it's so important. And frankly, at the UN, we face a challenge now. Compared to, Mark will know this, compared to so many conferences at the UN, which have thousands of people participating on the sidelines and in the streets and in a whole variety of ways, as they did at COP26. Here at the UN in New York, things are very, very tame. There are severe restrictions on a number of people who can come into meetings, and we've restricted the ability of NGOs to participate. And we're now having discussions with the UN about how we can get back to a period when the NGOs can participate far more fully. Obviously, they do on the technologies that are available to us today, but in actual physical meetings and face-to-face meetings, we've not seen that happen. We are in the middle of a great struggle right now between the forces of democracy and the forces of autocracy. And I can't say that there's huge momentum on the side of democracy at the moment. We look at what's happened in Afghanistan. We look at what's happening in Sudan today. The good news out of Sudan is that people are taking to the streets, are doing everything they can to overturn the effects of the coup. But we have to appreciate that in Afghanistan, we're seeing the collapse of civil societies and all other forms of activity there. And the situation is a humanitarian catastrophe and a very serious challenge for those of us who believe in pluralism and freedom of speech and who advocate that as something that we really, really believe in.
Right. Well, I very much thank you for that. I mean, in a way, the pandemic, I think, brings home to a lot of people, even in safe places, that life is a bit more fragile than they thought it was. And that could be useful, ideally. So this is part of what interests me, perhaps because I'm more of a political journalist, but I'm very struck by the debate about elitism. Right? Because certainly elites have profited from this disease, but there's also, as with climate, a kind of a sense out in the populace that this is an elite project, that the elite is controlling us, that climate is going to hurt the poorest, right? This was the Gilets jaunes. This leads to a strong sense of populism, that it's we who have to drive cars, who don't live in cities, who will pay the price, right? And I think this leads to this, this mistrust of a state which is acting ideally in the collective interest. So, Mark, in a way, that's kind of what I want to talk about. I'll start with you, but anyone, please join in. I mean, as the pandemic ideally begins to fade and become part of our daily lives, I think sort of like the flu, if we're lucky, do you see citizens' engagement aiding the effort to build back better or somehow restricting it given the sacrifices involved?
Well, I think, Steve,
The micro, sorry.
Steve, you perhaps have to start with the sort of fact that it's going to recede in one part of the world, but not in the other, because we haven't got to the vaccine rates in developing countries which would allow it to be contained there. So, there's a real risk of a two-speed, two-tier world with, and what we've seen about COVID is it is as much a social pathology as a public health one in its ability to find the weaknesses in our society and spring them open in a dramatic way. But I think, if I may, I think we also, are societies where the absence of rich, sophisticated narratives about the challenges we face, are really bringing us down. So you take COVID, one could also take climate. The costs, for example, to any of us here in well-protected Paris with high vaccine rates an Africa which is not vaccinated, the costs are borne by us all. Nobody's safe till we're all safe. And somehow those very simple points get lost. Or in the case of climate change, this view that we should all cut our emissions at one without understanding that in, again, a region like Africa, you have many countries with very limited energy access, and that those issues have to be addressed not through cutting and switching immediately to renewables, but by sensible transition strategies. And yet, in Glasgow, it was in a sense, a frame we must all cut together. And that's what made arriving at agreement, or has made arriving at agreement, so difficult. So, one of the things that healthy debate in our societies do is tease out these public policy challenges, that it's not all straightforward and easy. And, I fear that we're losing that capacity of what Bob Ray called dissent, because, it's in the other half of the social media. It's not the half we hear. We're all talking in echo chambers where everybody agrees with us, and the sort of richness of debate about choices we face as societies is hugely diminished in today's world. So, along with the physical restriction of civil space, social media has created a digital restriction of social space. Instead of being the enabling, inclusive media we anticipated, it's unfortunately become a kind of apartheid system where we just don't hear each other. We are separated by interests and class and geography in ways that don't allow a proper dialogue around issues anymore.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, I remember doing an Oxford Union debate early on about whether social media was good for democracy or bad for democracy. And I told them I could argue either side of it, because one can. So in the interest of continuing to talk about division, Mina, can I ask you about something I was going to bring up, but has been brought up here, which is this incredible divergence in vaccination and doses between not just Africa, but, the other world and the West, because the West is all agonizing about booster shots now. Even Belgium has bought 23 million extra doses for third shots. So what's happened with COVAX? Is there a kind of anger that's building, or do people just think, oh, well, that's just the way it always is?
You know, the question really highlights the issues of inequalities, and that's the basic issue, whether it's within borders or internationally, outside borders. And the inequalities of the economic system, the inequalities of the political system, the inequalities of the health systems are all going to be exacerbated during a pandemic. And so the challenge of these vaccine rates and issues needs to be addressed within the prism of inequalities. How do we move from that? How do we move that forward? Because once you make things, and a lot of that has got as well, is we have to deal at a very serious level with corporate accountability. How do we get corporates to be more sensible, and how do we make them players in society as opposed to being players for their own profits? So we've got to ask a lot of issues around that, and how do we run away, and how do we escape what some people call market fundamentalism, and make sure that these things are being used for all of us. So yes, so the levels of vaccination are quite low in Africa, partly because the vaccines took a long time to get there, and then when they got there, they've been, to be fair, they've been issued for free, and people can get them if you know where to get them. There are long lines at first, and they're coming through slowly. But it's an issue where I think many Africans will say, we are not surprised. We're not surprised because this is what happens to us. But we also know that and the sad thing is that what's happened as civil society has weakened globally is that people have learned to have individual solutions to public problems. Yes. So if I can't get my health care, I can't get good education, hey, I'm going to leave, and I'm going to take a boat, and I'm going to cross Sahara Desert, and I'm going to come to Europe where things are better. It's individual solutions. Or I'll decide then, okay, I can't get the resources to do this. I will be corrupt because I'll have the money to be able to live a good life. So we've got to figure out, and that's really a lack of good governance, a lack of political will and leadership, but also the fact that people have felt that no one's going to solve, we can't solve our problems collectively. We don't know how to do that yet, or we used to be able to do so. So I'll do it by myself and figure out my own solution. So, and that leads to, there's going to be an anger. There's going to be an anger about how, you'll come to us at some point and say, we want your resources, we want this and that from Africa, but you don't want us to be healthy. You don't want us to go to school properly. And yes, so this is and the young people, I think, are different from those of us now who are much older than before. And I think their reaction is something you cannot tell. I cannot guarantee that the reaction of young people will not be one that is quite angry and divisive and tension-packed, because there is anger. Why can't? Because now we know how the West lives, the global North lives. We see it. We see it. We know how it happens. We connect, and we can. It's no longer a hidden issue. So I think the world is playing with a time bomb.
This is interesting because I know Kenya has a very volatile social media scene, and it's in English largely. So lots of us can read it, and it's certainly open, and it's pretty passionate, I would say. But do you think the pandemic will be a way for the other world to make its case better? Do you think it's a chance to help reduce this inequality for the future, or is it an opportunity that isn't really there?
I think a lot of these questions around what's happening globally need first of all to make sure that the Africans are at the table. They can speak for themselves. Let them come to the table and speak. Let them organize themselves, and then they can have allies with others who can then help push and amplify the messaging that's going on. There's hopefully this, some of the most successful campaigns that have been run in many parts of Africa that have a link to the global North have been gone there, and people reach out to civil society in the global North, and then they work together, and you have great successes around corporate accountability, for example. We're part of some work with a company in Kenya that's owned by a British company around pineapple growing and avocados. And there's been it was actually an expose in the Sunday Times that then led the supermarket said, we're not going to import these avocados anymore, and all of a sudden the company began talking to the workers and talking to the civil society in Kenya. Before that, it wasn't working. But it's got when we think about building back better, I think it's a sense for all of us to say change must be governed by the people who need it. They must be running their own lives.
Yes.
And once that's gotten there, then you make allies with those who can help you. It can't change in Africa or in Bolivia or in Venezuela will not be done in New York or London or Paris or Madrid. It will be to happen on the ground. That's the most important people. And that change is something that we all need to look at, whether we're working at the UN or working in international organizations, wherever we're at. That's where the change has got to be.
Right.
It's got to be on the ground.
That's good. Bob, if I can ask you, I mean, not that you're representing the United Nations, you're representing Canada, which is fair. But around the UN, is there a sense that this is a kind of moment where the UN has learned something different about how it must respond?
Well, I think that there's a very keen sense here, Stephen, that first of all, I mean, the points that Mano was making about inequality being the central issue of our time. I think it is. I don't think there's any question that the biggest revelation of COVID and the way in which COVID is not a leveler. There's all this nonsense about we're all in the same boat. I mean, solidarity has been completely missing in our response to COVID. I think we have to be honest about that. And I think at the UN, that's a very live, real debate. What concerns me, though, is that the UN is made up of states. And many of the states that are represented here are autocratic, and they will have views about their own country. But within their own country, they don't want any interference. They don't want anybody else to know what's really going on. What's interesting is that it's this technology, the one that's allowing me to speak to you from New York and be present with you in Paris, is the same technology that we're now able to use. For example, the work of the Peace Building Commission, when I was chairing the commission, we had all kinds of meetings with representatives of civil society. We were able to engage civil society better in our meetings than ever before, because previously people had to come to New York for the meetings. Well, that doesn't need to happen. We can have these meetings directly. So the technology and the social media that is now expanding can actually be put to good use. But we should not make the mistake of thinking that the technology by itself will solve the problem. Because I think the other impact, that as Mark has talked about this, I think he's absolutely right. The technology is also severely isolating. And COVID has been reinforcing that isolation. And I come back to my point about solidarity. What's missing at COP, what's missing here at the UN, what's missing is a greater sense of solidarity, which doesn't mean that we obliterate differences and just all join in some collective thing. It means much more than that. It means that we listen and understand the differences between us, the difference in situation, be more aware of the importance of listening as opposed to talking. So I'm going to stop talking in a second. And it also means that we have to really engage each other and understand how serious the situation is. These three issues, the digital divide, which is growing, is not getting better. Many billions of people do not have access to the technology that we now take for granted. COVID-19 and climate change. These issues are global issues which should reinforce the vitality of the UN and of global institutions. But I think the reality is we wouldn't have had a UN in the first place without the active support of civil society, principally at that time in the United States when the UN was being formed. We wouldn't have the degree of support for the United Nations around the world without civil society. And we need to understand the threats that are now posed by this growth of autocracy and the growth of authoritarianism, which is a deeply, deeply troubling trend frankly, in many respects, in all of our countries. Because the dissent that is being expressed by some folks, if those dissenters were allowed to come into power, would lead to the end of dissent. And we know that. And so we have to be candid about what we see in the growth of authoritarianism. It's not just wacky ideas. It's ideas that actually at their root are profoundly authoritarian, that we see all around us. Dismissing science, dismissing dialogue, dismissing debate. These are not healthy trends, and we have to call them out.
No, I mean, it's also true in this, I don't know if it's a competition. Joe Biden likes to think of it as as some sort of competition between our democracies, however flawed they are, which they certainly are, and authoritarianism, which has a million varieties, or at least hundreds anyway. But if you're trying to gauge who does best with the pandemic, that's almost impossible because authoritarian societies won't let you look inside. How many people have died in China, Russia? Who knows? We'll never know. So, Lisa, if I could come back to you, do you feel engaged, as Bob said? I mean, do you feel this is a moment where your voice, what you stand for, is heard more or not?
I wouldn't be able to say if it's heard more, but we're definitely
Well, it's being heard
speaking a lot
today.
more than we're speaking a lot more than ever before. I think the one thing the pandemic has done it has ushered in an era of hyper local activism. So potentially every single person on this planet who has at least marginal access to technology is a potential civic activist. And I think the two things that really connect the activists we're seeing across the world and the definition of civil society, which is now much more diverse and much more, interconnected than ever before, is one, a profound anger with systems that perpetuate injustice. And I'm using the word profound because we mentioned earlier in the discussion of, this comment about protesters being being angry in a kind of a rash or unthinking way. That's not the activists we're seeing on the ground. We're seeing activists who really understand deep-rooted systemic injustice, and their actions are completely geared towards what it takes to drive intergenerational and system-wide change. And I think that's the difference really between the kind of groups we're seeing organizing and speaking today than before. And there's a reason why women, youth, excluded communities are at the forefront of most of the popular protests we're seeing across the world. It's because these are the groups that are traditionally excluded from formal decision-making spaces, and if I dare say, even from formal panels like this. So that's the group that's not waiting to be heard. It's the group that's actually creating the structures, creating the mechanisms to shape their own narrative, to connect ways in which they can act together, and to really bring and usher in, what Ambassador Rob was speaking of, a new era really of policy making and participation, which is not going to be brought in by governments. I think governments are really on the back foot. They're reacting in ways that actually represent fear. The entire militaristic and securitized approach is representative of the sheer ignorance, if I may say, of mature ways in which democratic participation is growing and needs to be handled.
Yes. Thank you. I mean, of course, governments, their first obligation is the health and protection of their citizens. So they tend to get militarized in those instances. But I do take your point. What can the world do? I mean, it's a sort of pathetic question, but to help Myanmar open up civic space. I mean, just so it doesn't become, as it was so long under Ne Win, just this forgotten, weird corner of the world.
Yeah, before answer your question, Tero, I'd like to support the issue raised by my colleague about the inequality.
Yes.
Yeah, because, when I was working around in Denmark, I saw the, promotion, for calling everyone to get vaccinated. Let's see that, some people don't want to be vaccinated. This is a choice. But, my thinking always returned back to my country, where vaccination is such a privilege. No one is, available to get it easily. There's a lot of issues. So that reminds your point of inequality. Because, according to the WHO, right to health is availability, accessibility, adaptability, and quality. So accessibility of this kind of medicine is a fundamental right. It's right to health. And also going back to your question about this is the obligation and responsibility of the state to make that kind of accessibility of this vaccination to everyone, particularly to who are marginalized and vulnerable. But in the country like Myanmar, right now, the military control everything.
Yeah.
Accessibilities, no. Availability only for the military. And quality of medicine is also a big question right now. So that really need to think about the right to health is an international standard, universal standard for everyone. But sometimes the government failed, or authorities fail to do that. Sometimes they intentionally stop that kind of accessibility of the people.
Yes.
So you have to think about who are the perpetrators, who are the main responsible for that. For in case of Myanmar, this is the military getting off everything and mismanaging the COVID situation. So very important to stop that kind of, malfunctioning power by the military.
Yes.
And then creating a space of the civil society as much as we could. In the country like Myanmar now, even though there's a really challenging time, civil societies and the civil space and activists, around the countries are taking by all means possible to restore democracy and human rights and demanding their space back. So that is where international can support to bringing the civil space back and supporting democratization and the struggle to stop the military.
Right. Thank you. Mark, it may be a little unfair, and you can say so, but you're a former UN official also, and you would think a global pandemic is a perfect place for the United Nations to get ahead of the story, to react, to create global structures for, because as you say, everyone is involved. There could be a new variant tomorrow somewhere. So WHO obviously has had its problems. Obviously, the UN is run by big states often, but are there lessons, do you think, how has the UN not captured this moment for itself? Because I don't think it has. Maybe other people disagree with me.
Well, look, I don't know whether it's an individual or an institutional failure. I obviously cast my mind back to when I was Kofi Annan's deputy and we faced the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And I remember the bully pulpit, him bringing Big Pharma into the room and saying, you either make treatments available and affordable in developing countries, or there will be a TRIPS waiver and we will license generic manufacture. But it wasn't just Kofi alone. It was a president in the White House, President George Bush. It was enlightened leaders in Europe. It was partners in Africa, all of whom came together to recognize here was a global crisis that required a global response. So, yeah, I'm sorry to say the UN has failed at the first base on this, but I think it would be wrong to single out the UN leaders themselves because it's a much wider failure of leadership. It's leaders putting their own first. Donald Trump is gone, but the sort of Make America Great Again doctrine is alive and well, not just in America, but in so many countries around the world, where you have a world, in Kofi's day, 2/3 of the world's states were broadly democratic across to the Freedom House rankings. Today, less than 25% of the world's population live in fully democratic states. And that shows it's not just that civil society gets suppressed, it's that honest multilateral collaboration to solve problems is also suppressed. So we live in, as we've all said, a very unequal world, a very unfair world, and a world where leadership is absent. And, ultimately that sort of brings us back to where we begin, the need for civic space, because it will be new leaders who come from the streets and from the internet, who are going to challenge these failing establishments, these failing elites, as you put them. I mean, I think we're at actually quite a revolutionary moment. I think there is a lot of pent-up anger. We've heard it from Minor in terms of Africa. We've heard it in terms of Myanmar as well. But, you know, I actually think our own younger generation in our Western countries as well share it. Leadership is failing us.
Yeah. Bob, I wondered if you wanted to respond to that. Maybe I've been unfair, and I want to give you the chance.
No, I don't think you have, and I don't think Mark has been unfair either. And that's why I think this is a very healthy discussion. I think we need to recognize that, as I said, there are these global challenges that have to be met effectively by our global institutions. And right now, the global institutions have not been able to respond. I think where Mark is also right is to say, but don't just blame the institutions. You know, you don't blame Madison Square Gardens every time the Knicks lose the basketball game, right? I mean, you've got to say it's actually the players on the field and all the players on the field who have to take responsibility for that. And I think that's a fair comment. We're not at the moment now where we were 25 years ago. We are where we are today with all of its dysfunctions. And the UN reflects those dysfunctions, unfortunately, only too perfectly. It's just a mirror of who's here and who's doing what and who's leading and who's not leading and who's blocking and who's stopping us from doing what we're doing. And I think there's a ton that we have to do better and that we have to do better collectively. But I also share in the optimism that as long as we can keep the civic space alive, and that's why this issue of democracy, I don't think it's a competition. I think it's a much more adversarial business than that. I mean, we're in a fight for pluralism. We're in a fight for dissent. We're in a fight for openness, and that fight is very tough to win. And there are big countries who do not want this, do not want openness, and who do not believe in pluralism. And so, yes, these ideas are at risk, and I think we have to continue to fight for them. And the UN is not going to be a place where these issues are resolved perfectly, but at least we can say the UN is going to be a battlefield where these issues are going to be fought out and tested.
Yes.
And that's how we see it in Canada. We see the UN's critical role right now is to be a place where we can make the case for democracy and for pluralism and demonstrate to people what happens when the lights go out. And we do not want these lights to go out.
No, good. Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I have some questions that have come in. So I'm going to ask the first question, and anyone who wants to respond to it. The question is, with many services and social activity moving online, it's a social media question, of course, how can we use social media to improve civil society? What are the advantages, disadvantages, challenges found in the digitalization of the civil space is the question. Go ahead.
Let me try that, because I also have a hat as member of the Facebook Oversight Board.
Oh, God.
So so that's a good question. I like that. And let me just say that I think it's a good question. I think it's a very good question about social media. I think the social media, or some variant of it, is here to stay. That is a reality. I think that there's work to be done to make sure that there's more access to the internet and to social media, so it's so that these inequalities we're talking about are addressed, so people have access really to internet. But I think also that the social media companies have to also start addressing their own role in accentuating divisions and all the algorithms that seem to lead people into these rabbit holes that they can't come out of, and figure out a way to have some form of a safe, healthy environment where people can have those debates we're talking about. That's got to be done. I think that, for all the issues around there, I think the Oversight Board is a first attempt to try and do something around content more moderation and figure out how to hold a company as big and as powerful as Facebook a little accountable. And although you were there at the meeting at the session with Francis Hogan, there's a lot to be done. But I think there's got to be more and more thinking, and how can we do this? How can we scale up that? How can we go into a level that's international? Even as though you're going through, even as people talk about regulation, which seems to be one of the ways in which you can have a better space, you've got to be careful about nationalized regulation, because then it can bring the bar down. You don't want Russia or China doing the regulation. You don't want, so you want to make sure it's at a space which has space for human rights to expression to continue, but in a manner that is helpful as opposed to being hurtful. So this, and as he says, as Ambassador says, dissent is a significant part of democracy and the space we want. But we also want to have good, healthy debates that can take us forward. So I think, yes, so social media is a player. It's good. It's a constant, and whichever way we look at it, is going to be there. So it's our role now to try and make it safe and useful,
or
as opposed
safer anyway.
Safer and useful to the issues of civic space. But it's people organizing on it. People call out to go and protest and save their civic space around it. So it's a way to move forward. Yeah.
Yes. Lisa, do you want to talk about that at all?
No, I think we're very aware of the dangers, really, of technology. And I want to talk beyond social media, because obviously the internet is far more than the corporate spaces that we use. So I think what the last 2 years have done really is enable many more civil society actors, and especially social movement actors, to look at where there needs to be stronger oversight and regulation over the private sector, and particularly big tech, in these issues, but also how we work much better with governments in putting in place, both regional, national, and global governments, in putting in place the kind of accountability mechanisms that we are very good at articulating when it comes to oversight over the state, but not so good at articulating when it comes to oversight over non-state actors. And maybe I just want to add another point, that it's a seeming irony that although more and more people, in a way, are facing attacks on their civic freedoms, what we're seeing is, even in most closed or repressed contexts, the ability really to redesign strategies, to redesign ways in which communities and citizens can push back is only increasing. So somehow I think it's like that quote of creating the yearning for the sea. So, we're not having to give people explicit tools in terms of how they can engage and organize, because the yearning for justice, the yearning for civic freedoms, and the yearning for democracy is so pervasive, especially in younger generations, that they're always going to find a way to get around it. So whether it's Eswatini, whether it's, the shutdowns that happened in Sudan or Nigeria or India, people are continuously pushing back. People are continuously finding new and innovative ways to claim their civic freedoms again. And that's why I think we're at this really precarious but also exciting moment where, more governments, and especially more governments like we are seeing in New Zealand or Taiwan or other places, where you have feminist leadership and mature leadership that understands dissent and understands debate. We need more of that.
Okay.
And we need to stop this kind of false, opposition of governments and citizens, because we really need to work together to build back or build forward better.
Yes, great. I like this idea of precarious and exciting. That's very well said. Mark, go ahead.
Look, I mean, we've talked about the dangers of the social media, but I think we've also touched on the utility of the kind of communications platform that it provides. And Bob talked about how NGOs that might not previously have been able to come to New York to participate in the UN Peacebuilding Commission can now do so over Zoom. Take that to the mass scale, and for pretty much every protest this year, social media communication has been a critical way to amplify that voice and try to stay the hand of local security forces from intervening. In the first 5 months of this year, there have been 50 close downs of country-wide internet systems by 21 governments. No surprise that they include Myanmar, Afghanistan, Sudan, Ethiopia, so this attempt to close down the space is critical. And I just want to make one little ad in that Open Society, together with the Ford Foundation, has funded Civicus, Lisa, to run a network to try and defend civil space around the world. And what that network needs, and this is why the Paris Peace Forum brings governments, multilateral organizations, and civil society together, is some government backing. Now, Bob, you were called a decaffeinated America before. I used to, when introducing your colleagues at the UN, begin by saying, if an NGO could be a country, it would be Canada, which is almost as offensive, I suspect, but as funny. And, I would just appeal to Canada, to Norway, to Sweden, to these kinds of governments to join us, because if we have some intergovernmental support, and it's not just foundations and organizations like Civicus, we can put up a much more robust defense of civil space around the world.
Great. And we've got now 1 minute left, so you have the last word.
Thank you.
Up to you.
Within 1 minute, I will be short.
Okay, 1 minute, 14 seconds.
Okay, so the internet and social media play a very important role and very useful for me, like monitoring situation, documentation of human rights cases, and using these cases for the UN, the advocacy at the UN, what's going on the ground. But, sometimes people use it and people abuse it. So very, very important for us to use this kind of modern technology for the good sake of the human rights, but not abuse it by spreading hate speech and threatening the individual rights of the other people, not making too much propaganda for their crimes. So this is very important. So my last message, please use the social media, but don't abuse it. Use it wisely for the sake of the humanity. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you all. This has been very helpful to me, very interesting. I really thank all our panelists. I thank people who sent in questions, and one has to stay optimistic, and there are lots of ways, lots of cracks where the light gets in. So let's hold to the light and have a good evening, everyone, and thank you for paying attention. Good night.
Welcome back. We are almost coming towards the tail end of day 2 of Paris Peace Forum. And I just want to reflect, today is also the last day of COP26, which is known to be the largest gathering of world leaders to address the climate crisis. And I read a report which really perturbed me greatly, that there were 500 fossil fuel delegates represented at COP26, and if that was to be equated, lobbyists rather, if that was to be equated as country delegates, they would be the largest country representation. And in parallel, you saw a lot of indigenous young climate activists on the outside, and I hear a lot of chatter about that it is a failure, it was youth washing, it was greenwashing, that they didn't get the results that they wanted. Even if countries meet all the commitments, it's just 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is way beyond what we can achieve, a hope to survive in a healthy planet. I say all this because the largest gathering of parties seemingly has failed young people. So I want to put you on the spot and ask you, we're at the tail end of day 2 of the forum. What is the impact that we have had here from a very realistic perspective to the people tuning in and watching? What can they take away from the forum and be like, you know what, this is what we said, beyond the talk shop. So what is the actual impact, the work that's happening here, going to have on the lives of people?
That's a fair question, and it's a question that is very often asked to us. We have lots of debates, almost 80 sessions. We have also 80 projects. We have a lot of activity, but what comes out of it? I would say that it's the addition of the gathering, the convening function, of the meeting and debating function, and of the, I would say, supporting function as they relate to the projects, and to the incubating function that we have for projects that really explain why we have impact. Let me give you a very concrete example on space. Space issues. Space belong to everyone, to every human. And we know we have a problem. That was the important initiative that was launched today at the forum, the Net Zero Space Initiative. And we need to do something about that. And so what happened today was three things. First, we gathered various nations and parties around the table to discuss it. We had Chinese, we had Americans, we had Nigerians, we had Indians, your fellow countrymen. We had Europeans, obviously, and others. And the forum serves as a ground where these parties can meet. Second, we launched the initiative. The initiative itself, that is, we gathered space agencies, industries, and other actors that committed to stabilizing and then decreasing the mass of debris in space between now and 2030. And so that's the Net Zero Space Declaration, which was supported by many, including a large group of parliamentarians around the world. But we also had sort of bottom-up project on the same issue. Obviously you don't have so many NGOs working on space, but we had three very interesting projects. And let me just tell you, by way of answering your question, let me tell you about them. One was the University of Tokyo, which presented a project on the norms for what is called the proximity and rendezvous operation. It's not anything romantic or related to dating, but rather it's the rules that should be applied to satellites when they get closer to one another, for example, either for servicing the satellite or for removing it from an orbit. And it seems a bit technical, but it's really important because these rules do not exist. That is, a satellite can come next to another one without breaking any rules. And we'll need that more and more because we need to remove satellites from orbits. And so the University of Tokyo has done this normative work, this legal work on that. The second project is exactly that. That is to say, how do we remove debris and old satellites from the orbit in order to avoid accidents? And there have been many accidents in orbit, so many that they threaten the good use of space, which would, of course, deprive us in case of an accident of GPS, of a imagery alert system, etc. And so we have a company called Astroscale from Japan, which has conducted already tests in outer space on how to remove debris and satellites from space. They are the cleaners of space, if you'd like. And the third project we have is a young startup called Share My Space. They come from France, actually. And what they do is what they call in the jargon SSA, Space Situation Awareness. You can picture space as a crossroad down in the street. And what they provide at Share My Space is intelligence on what are the vehicles circulating on that road. And it's really important because so far only very few countries have an SSA capability. And so in particular, developing countries and others that are new spacefaring nations do not have that capability. So they're providing this. Generally, it's the Americans providing it for the rest of the world, or the Europeans or others, and they're providing it. So we put forward these three projects on space that we are putting on the spot, that we are helping, that we are giving visibility to, in order to solve that question of space debris in a very concrete way.
And I also love, but I also, what I really love about this is that the geography of these projects is coming from the south.
Yep.
Right. So very often when we hear about anything to do with AI, space, we see it being led from Europe, from America. So it's really interesting. I also want to ask you, Paris Peace Forum has been consistently saying that we want to address the climate crisis. And today we had a very interesting convening of military leaders, of world leaders committing to do something with their military to address the climate crisis. So perhaps you could tell the people who may have missed that, what was that initiative about?
Absolutely. So talking about impact, and that's still by way of answering your question on impact, what happened this morning was very interesting. Generally when we talk about climate change and the military, it's to say that climate change has an impact on military operations, or that climate change is degrading reading the geopolitical situation in many places in the world. What happened this morning was very different because it was not the impact of climate change on the military, but rather the impact of the military on climate change. And what these 15 nations decided to do was to put their military on a sustainable path regarding emissions, and to try to curb the emissions produced by the military, and military have a lot of hardware. Sometimes in some countries they also control a large part of the economy. So it's important that in that great family of climate action, we also have the military, and that's concrete change because it means that on military bases, when they are in operations, when they are at sea, when they are on air, they will now, these 15 countries at least, will pay attention to what CO2 they produce.
Thank you for that. And I also want to share that a lot of the work that we've been doing across the 2 days has been centered with a gender-sensitive lens, right? Because there is an acknowledgement that COVID has affected one gender more than the other. So throughout the forum, you have seen sort of really forward-thinking gender commitments, then be it from the chef d'etat who did it on the opening ceremony, as well as today we had a panel on gender parity where you had the Minister of Gender from France, Elisabeth Morena. We had the Deputy CEO of L'Oréal talking about very timely fashion about how they have paternal leave rolled out, and I think it's interesting to talk about that just when the United States is having this conversation in terms of pushing for paternity leave, as well as one of our project leaders who also joined us from venture capitals, and it was really interesting to see sort of these dynamical plays of civil society, of venture capitalists, of business, one of the largest corporations, as well as a diplomat talking about the role of gender equality to address all of the crises that we're facing right now. I want to come back to the forum. For the people who are going to join us on the last day, day 3, and may perhaps think that, okay, I've already extrapolated the best it's possible. We engage in a lot of topics. It's a wide range of topics, and they may have perhaps fatigue. Give them 3 good enough reasons for why they need to wake up tomorrow and stay tuned and continue to join the last day of the forum.
Let me start with the life of the forum itself. And you know that, as usual, as we do it traditionally, tomorrow during the closing ceremony, we will disclose the 10 projects that will be supported by the SCUP, by the Forum owns Scale-Up Committee. And we've been doing that since 2018. So we now have a cohort of 30 projects that have been supported by the SCUP, and will take in 10 more. So that's reason one. That will be at 4:30 p.m. Paris time at the beginning of the closing ceremony, and we'll reveal what their names are. That's the first reason. The second reason, I would say, is climate. So tomorrow we have a number of sessions on climate, and the reason is COP26 is supposed to end tonight, as you mentioned earlier. And so we'll do an assessment of our COP26 during that same closing ceremony at 4:30 p.m. after announcing the projects, in particular with views from China, from Europe, from the US on what COP26 has achieved and what the assessment is. And lastly, I would say tomorrow we still have a number of sessions on projects. And so we still have many projects that will be presented. Believe me, many of them are quite fascinating and mind-capturing, I would say. And so that's a third reason to stay tuned tomorrow during the day. There will be a full day of sessions, but especially these projects that we'll be able to discover.
Thank you. I see Adrien standing there like this. So I must ask you, Adrien is someone who is managing a lot of our public policy portfolio, which is something new that we have started with Paris Peace Forum, right? So far, we have been launching initiatives related to public policy when it came to others, chef d'etat, people coming. I think this year, Paris Peace Forum, not that you didn't have enough on your plate, you have decided to also take leadership in terms of launching and incubating public policy-oriented projects. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So we've started these projects. I mentioned space at length, of course, and that we incubated, but also something that we didn't speak much about was the work we did on climate. And here it's really important to go to both go boldly but also go slowly. And so we've been gathering a group of international experts and policymakers for a full year, from the north, from the south, a vice president of the IPCC, former diplomats and specialists. And we are going towards, we are oriented towards the creation of a global commission on these issues to go beyond, and we'll see tonight or tomorrow what COP26 has resulted in, but basically to go beyond the sometimes too exclusive focus on mitigation of greenhouse gases, and to go a bit towards the issue not only of adaptation but also of warming as such, that is to address warming as such, going in the direction of carbon capture, for example, solar, geoengineering. All of these issues need governance, and what the Paris Peace Forum has been providing so far is help in coordinating and governing these issues. And so we are going in this direction. Tomorrow there will be a panel dedicated to that, and that's one of the directions that we'll be taking in 2022.
That's incredibly exciting. I also think it shows a really good growth of Paris Peace Forum, where for the first 3 years we have sort of platformed initiatives that address public policy. I know your academic policy-loving heart always prioritizes that. And to see this sort of change in terms of year 4, not a change, but a natural progression, where Paris Peace Forum is taking leadership to incubate and sort of put forward a policy-driven project that is, you know, not just platforming an initiative of other people, but sort of leading it with all the experience that we've had over the last 3 years. So I, for one, am incredibly excited about that. Please remember that if you have missed any of our incredible panels or sessions, you can always watch it on replay on our digital platform. So, you know, you don't need to lament that you've missed your favorite speakers. You can watch it on replay. You can tell us what you thought about it by tagging us on Twitter and using the hashtag Paris Peace Forum 2021. I will give you the floor, Justin, for perhaps any last thoughts that you have when it comes to the last day of the forum.
Well, you know, we've had 2 very exciting days, the official ceremony and the panels of yesterday, the many panels of today, and the initiatives that were launched. And so I'm really looking forward to this 3rd day, and I hope you will be once again many to join us online, perhaps on the social networks and on Twitter and elsewhere. So have a good night, everybody, and see you tomorrow. We're starting as early as 9:15 a.m. tomorrow, Paris time.
Okay, so 9:15 a.m. is your first session. Thank you. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.